Okay, we are now recording. So in days 1 and 2, we really established, um, what the science of reading is, what dyslexia is, what those signs and symptoms are to look for. And I loved our conversation at the end of day 2's workshop. We had a really nice discussion around some really great questions. And so today, my hope is that we go through a lot of strategies to help. So what do? We've established that we have all these students who need different approaches to learn how to read. And what are those approaches, and how can we use those, throughout our school day and within the lessons we're providing? So did any of you have a chance to attend the conference last Friday, the Wisconsin Reading League conference? I didn't, okay, no one was there. It was their first annual, and if you have an opportunity next year, it was really fantastic. They had 7 pretty big name speakers, and one of their speakers who spoke at the very end of the day, she started at like 4:30. This conference went till about 5:30, 5:45. It was a late day, long day. And her name was Angie Hanlon, and maybe some of you know her. She's the superintendent of the Thorpe School District. And she just had such an inspirational, powerful message to share. What a passionate woman. But this was one of the quotes that she shared in her presentation. And I often share this one as well, when I'm teaching undergrad and grad students at UW-Oshkosh. And I feel like I share this quite often, but I haven't been in a district who has done this before, but she has. So this quote just, it screamed just so much excitement to hear her talk about being in a district whose reading scores across the district, I want to say she said, we're around like 18% proficiency level, which is so horrendously low. Brought in the science of reading, started systemically, changing how the teachers in a district looked at reading, how they approached reading, how they taught reading. And when it was all said and done, their district benchmarks went right up to 95% proficiency. And I just thought that was so powerful, because this quote is right out of the research. This is Louisa Moat's research in Speech to Print, her book that came out in 2020, excellent book. But if you have an opportunity, check out the Reading League conference next year. It was just fantastic. And she was a great testimony to this quote, bringing 95% of her district up to grade level in reading. So we've established that dyslexia represents 80 to 90% of all learning disabilities. We've established it's the most common reason a student will struggle with reading, affects 15 to 20% of our population. We've also established that the science of reading has shown us how our brains learn to read. Despite popular theory, we don't learn to read by guessing or by whole word method. We learn to read through a process called orthographic mapping. Since we know these things, it's pretty safe to say that our schools, by and large, need to learn how to screen, teach, and support students who show the characteristics of dyslexia. Whether we call it dyslexia or a specific reading disability in decoding type or whatever we call it, we need to know how to identify it and teach those students so they make the most progress they possibly can. So that's where we're at. Now, another bit of research, and this comes out of the Burschen character text, The Multisensory Teaching of Basic Language Skills. They say that, full-blown LD can actually be prevented, provided there's early intervention in place, early screening, early intervention, if a teacher knows the science of reading and they know what to teach and how to teach. And this is just so powerful as well. So this content information is just transforming for students' lives. So we took a look at this slide, I believe on day 1, and this is just grounding us in in our approach here, in that if you have a student who has that reading profile of decoding needs, the best type of intervention is going to be the most structured type of intervention. Now, if you have a student who has a profile of comprehension needs, a great approach might be your Fontes and Pinnell, your balanced literacy type programs, if they're comprehension needs only. Now, if you have a student with a mixed need, they need decoding and they need comprehension, we're going to have to figure out both covered, right? So a lot of people do use structured literacy and add the comprehension piece into it. Linguistic methods are kind of like your SRA, your director instruction programs. Those can be fantastic for kids that are just hovering, right below grade level. But when you get these really big deficits, these really big gaps between grade level and where they're functioning, that's where you want to get the most bang for your time and really go structured and explicit all the way. Now, Orton-Gillingham it's pretty prescriptive. It's kind of like going to the doctor, and the doctor doesn't just say, oh, you have a cold. The doctor is going to say, well, you have bronchitis, you got pneumonia, you got sinus infection. They're going to be pretty prescriptive on what you have. And they're going to be really prescriptive about what you take to remedy that problem. Orton-Gillingham is the same way. And I'm going to use the terms Orton-Gillingham and structured literacy synonymously here. We have a request through the chat that there's some background noise. If everyone could just make sure that your microphones are muted, that would be great. So these are the pieces that we want to teach when we're following a structured approach. There's a lot of content here, a lot of content. Now keep in mind that Orton-Gillingham is a building block style process. So we start at the very foundation, building a strong base, and we build from part to whole, as opposed to whole to parts. How you teach is also very important. So, it's one thing to know what to teach, but if you don't know how to present it in a manner that sticks, that clicks for the child and for their memory, it's not going to do much good. So we want to make sure our instruction is explicit, meaning it's not implied, it's clearly stated. We want to make sure it's cumulative and scaffolded. So meaning building block process. We start at the base and we build up from there. And it's supported, the learning process is supported as much as possible when it's needed. This goes in terms of pacing too, right? We can't say, well, we're in a program or we're using an intervention and my student's here, and so that means they'll be here in X amount of months. Because we have to go with the pacing of each individual child. So we move as fast as we can, but as slow as we must. We want to make sure we're systematic about what we're teaching. So when you're using Orton-Gillingham based interventions, either you have training in writing your own lessons, using this type of structured lesson template, or a lot of teachers in our schools, they use programming that's Orton influenced. And there are several programs on the market that are very good, that are Orton influenced. And we want to make sure we're following them with fidelity. So if you have a progression for your program, or you have a progression of skills that you've selected for your lessons, and we want to make sure we stick to that progression with fidelity and we're not skipping around. That's really important, because our students with dyslexia, they tend to have unexpected holes in their skills. They're going along fine, and then boom, they have this hole in their skill set, and then they have a strong area, and then they have a weak area. It is seemingly unexpected sometimes when you compare it to their intelligence. It's also recommended that our instruction is mnemonic based whenever possible, just to aid that memory process, because so many of our students with learning disabilities have struggles with memory, working memory, but also auditory memory, phonologic memory, orthographic memory, all sorts of memory systems that are going on in the learning process. So Linnea Airy was the researcher that we talked about in day one, The most cited reading researcher in the past 40 years with over 160 publications. These are the 4 ways, remember, that she said we have to cover, the 4 necessary requirements we have to cover when we're teaching students to read, taking into consideration the science of reading and how our brain acquires language, written and spoken language. So we're going to walk through these pieces today and take a look at some strategies you can use to work with kids. I'm moving kind of fast through some of this stuff because you did already see some of these pieces in day 1 and day 2. The first requirement that Ari had said in her research that's necessary is just basic. Do kids know their letters? Do they know their letter names? Do they know their letter sounds? Do they have that letter sound connection, the correspondence? And so as a teacher, no matter your age of your student, you do want to make sure that your students have these things in place and they have automaticity with these skills. And you might be surprised or not surprised that you have some mid to upper level elementary and even some middle school kids who confuse some of their letter sound correspondences and maybe even some of the letter names. So you do want to screen and make sure assessment does drive your instruction. So you could use a screener like this. There's tons of screeners on the market like this. You can make one yourself, but make sure you get a good grip on where they're at in terms of letter sound correspondence. This is such a basic screener here. For our more advanced students, you could take that up a notch and you could do much more advanced concepts. I have a more advanced screener too, with all of the diphthongs and units of sound, like your TURE, your TION, your SION. You'll see if they can read those phonetic patterns on the fly, just fast, look at it and read it. And then you could flip this around as well. Take away the letters. Say the sounds, have them repeat the sound, and can they write the phonetic pattern that represents that sound? So that's the flip side of decoding. You get your decoding, which is your reading, but then the flip side is your encoding, which is your spelling. And the two really do need to support one another for really efficient learning. So step 1, make sure we got these letter names down pat. That's usually a K and 1 level concept, even pre-K, but then make sure you got your letter sound correspondence down. And no matter what level your student might be, they might be beyond this point, but you can check an upper level phonetic screener. Now, something that's also in Ari's research and what the science of reading tells us we need to make sure that students have sufficient segmenting and blending skills. There's 7 different phonemic awareness skills, but those 2 are the really, really big ones. It's kind of a make or break. If a student, no matter their age, can't segment a word into sounds or take a larger word and segment out the syllables, if they can't hear those syllables, they're going to really have a hard time spelling. And likewise, will probably have a hard time reading as well. This is a super low-level phoneme segmentation screener, and it simply give the student a word. So if I were to give the student the word sled, can they break that word into its prospective sounds? Can they go s, o, e, d, and represent those sounds with a manipulative? So this screener is done void of letters. The student doesn't look at any letters at all. It's completely auditory. So when you're starting structure literacy lessons with a student, it's really necessary to make sure they've got a grasp on this real basic level of segmentation and blending. You could flip this and blend, use it as a screener for blending as well. If you're looking for a higher level, more comprehensive screener, I should go back because I'm still talking about this, on phonological processing, check out The Past, which is David Kilpatrick's screener. He published the book, authored the book, Equipped for Reading Success. Fantastic resource for phonological processing, teaching, and screening. I don't have a picture of his screener in this presentation, but it is free online. You can download it. There's 4 forms, so you can use it, for benchmarking. And what's neat about his screener is it's developmentally organized. So it goes from pre-K and K, first grade, second grade, all the way through high school and adult level. And it's got all the different phonemic awareness skills mixed in. So we've got deletion and substitution, and those skills are given at the beginning of words, end of words, middle of words. So what I've got in front of you is a very basic level. If you need something more advanced, more comprehensive, David Kilpatrick has a wonderful resource you could use. Now, I always share this type of a screener because what happens if you start working with a student using a very explicit and structured approach, something Orton Gilliam based, and gosh, they're just not making progress. They hit these roadblocks all the times with the sounds. And there are several different reasons. There's some other pitfalls you could run into in your instruction when that happens. But one of the most common pitfalls I see is trouble with brief auditory discrimination and auditory memory. This is a discrete skill that not a lot of teachers, in my experience, know to look at or screen for. So, if you're in the special education world, this might be a really nice tool for you to add to your toolkit. What you're doing here is, again, the student doesn't see any letters. They don't have anything in front of them. They just have tiles in front of them or tokens. And you're simply giving a series of sounds. So as a teacher, I would say, for instance, The student would repeat those back. Okay, that's the first test. Can they even repeat the sequence of 3 sounds back? Secondly, they would have to then pull down one tile or manipulative for each sound while they say that sound. Okay, step 2. Now we're getting into auditory memory, holding on to those sequences of sounds. The other part of this is discrimination. Can they hear the difference between very similar sounds? So the practice prompts are not similar. This is just to get the kids warmed up. But the prompts below that, a lot of them are very similar. Sh, ch, j, sh. And a lot of times our students, they can't hear the difference between several of these sounds. Now, if students have a couple problems, well, no big deal. They get a couple wrong. We can work with that. But if you give a screener like this and your student has 4 completely wrong, and you've repeated the prompts a couple times, or more than 4 wrong, whoa, slow down, because they're going to need some of these holes plugged. Because if you can't hear the difference between the sounds, and if you can't hold on to sequences of 3 sounds long enough to work with them, you're going to have a really, really hard time sounding words out and spelling. So all of the screeners I'm showing you, I do have video tutorials for, and I don't have those listed here, but if you want them, email me and I'll send you the tutorial, because they can be really, really pretty eye-opening. So I always say, kind of our prerequisite skills before you start an Orton Gillingham-based system or intervention is really make sure those letter sound correspondences are there. The most basic ones, just the 26 most common sounds. Make sure the auditory memory and discrimination is there at a very basic level, like what I just showed you. And make sure at a very basic level, they can at least segment a CVC word. If they can't, bring it back down to a 2-sound word, like a CV word or nonsense word, and see if you can build up from there. If they have those 3 basic skills in place, you're sitting pretty good to start a structured literacy-based intervention. So let's take a look at instructional design. I work with students at the university, pre-service teachers, and a lot of them either have jobs already in education or they're going to have a position as a teacher soon. And they go, well, what do I do if I get into a district and all we have is for instance, like a balanced literacy system, and I need something more structured. What can I do? And I always say, well, advocate, right? Advocate for your needs, for your students' needs. But secondly, let's incorporate a 3-part drill into the lessons you're using. So before you start your lesson of the day, do a 3-part drill with your student. And this is classic Orton Gillingham. What this is a 3-step process that serves as a reading and spelling review. And it incorporates your visual, your auditory, and your kinesthetic senses simultaneously. So you're getting a crash course today. We could talk for days on this stuff, but essentially what you want to do is first get a deck of letter cards. Those are called phoneme grapheme cards. You can usually print those off online for free, laminate them, or you can pick up a deck of phoneme grapheme cards for usually around $30 or so. And you're going to put in your deck of cards only the sounds that students have been explicitly taught and know. And you're going to show a card. Students are going to say the sound. And you're going to go through this really fast because remember, we're pushing for automaticity. It's great if students know their sounds, but if it takes them too long to pull that sound out, they're not going to end up being a fluent reader. So first drill is a visual drill. The second drill, you put those cards aside, but you're going to use a selection of those letter sounds, and you're going to give the student the sound. So for instance, I might say, ah. The student repeats, ah. They have a sand tray in front of them or a whiteboard or even just pencil paper, and they write down the letters that can say ah, the letters they've learned. So they'll say A says ah. All right, so we're using different senses to retrieve letter names, letter sounds, and then thirdly, we're blending. Teachers will take those phoneme grapheme cards, and again, you're only using the cards that have the students know and have been explicitly taught, and we're going to make patterns. They could be nonsense, they could be real words, and we're going to have the students touch and say each sound and blend. Another way to state that is to pound and sound. So if the word is fab, if I've built the word fab, and I think I have a picture of this coming up. Okay, yeah. So here are an example of the cards I'm referring to. It's what you'd use for step 1 and step 3. Here's step 2, where they're writing the letter for the sound that they hear. This is called sensory sand. It's kind of a cool sand because it's a fine grit with a heavy grit, and so it leaves kind of an image of what you're writing behind. You can use anything. You can use pencil paper too. Pencil is preferred over pen because there's more drag, so there's more input on the fingertips. If you talk to an OT, that's what they'll tell you. And here's step 3. So as you can see, you got your phoneme grapheme cards. you've built a word. The student is touching under each pattern, saying that sound. So the student would go sh, and, shunned, and they would blend it as a last step and then say it fast like a word. Here's an example of a blending board. It's just a piece of wood. Sometimes they're plastic. If you're teaching a small group or a whole group, you could use this to set your cards on, as opposed to just, having it sitting on a desktop. It depends on the format you're using. So the real simple crash course directions are here for you. But if you need to see this in action, Google a 3-part drill, Orton Gillingham examples. And there are some really great examples on YouTube. So you can watch all 3 of these steps with teachers in the classroom. All right, so those are some simple strategies for decoding, for reading. I recommend doing your 3-part drill before your lessons. And spelling is the other part of the equation here. And we'll talk more decoding too later, but I'm going to move our faces somewhere else. Here we go. Now I have a more clear view. So if you go back to Scarborough's reading rope, you're going to see that spelling is included under decoding. It's a very important part of the decoding process. I personally feel like, now I'm not a researcher, but if I were a researcher, I feel like spelling should technically be the 6 elements of the big 5. You've got your vocab, comprehension, fluency, phonics. I think spelling should be in there. Because if we can build a strong speller by teaching understanding of the way that we spell and why we spell the way we do, we are also going to build a strong reader. There's just no way around it, no way at all. But the opposite isn't true. Just because you're teaching reading in an explicit, systematic manner, it doesn't always equate to building a strong speller, but that spelling piece will really reinforce your reading. So, I'm not sure are any of you familiar with the VAC triangle, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic triangle? You probably are. So some background on this. Most teaching is done using your auditory and your visual. So a teacher talks and they show, they talk and they show, which is great. Our students, though, that have reading struggles really benefit from that 3rd sense being added into their instruction as much as possible, that kinesthetic sense. And when we refer to simultaneously multisensory, that's precisely what this means. It's engaging multiple senses at the same time. We could really talk quite a bit about that language triangle. I thought I had another slide on it, but I'm thinking of a different presentation. Another way to use that language triangle, I'm going to go back to that real quickly here, is if you give a student, this is interesting. So if you give a student a sound, so let's say we're doing our 3-part drill and we're in the 2nd part of that drill. So let's say our sound prompt is, I don't know, D. Okay, and they cannot come up with a letter that says D. What's really cool to see happen is if you have been practicing in some of the sensory sand in using some of these methods, if you have the student take their fingers and go to trace that sound, oftentimes that kinesthetic memory kicks in to support the visual memory, and they're able to pull out the information they need that D is produced by the letter D, which is pretty fun. So you can work this triangle in multiple directions. You can go from auditory. If your prompt is auditory, you can move to kinesthetic, You could go from kinesthetic to visual or visual to kinesthetic. But the focus here is to support the weak sense with an alternate sense to help the memory process. I hope that's making sense. I know I'm moving kind of quickly here because I know we're limited on time. So if you have questions after this, we certainly can talk through it more. So spelling does build the reading brain. And it's kind of crazy to think that a lot of school districts, especially in southern Wisconsin, they're not teaching spelling anymore. It's kind of wild because, we all speak English, we all live in America, and we all have to communicate using our language. And so to not teach spelling is just a huge loss of learning opportunity, especially if you're teaching spelling using the rules, using systematic and explicit approaches. Louisa Motes she's done a lot of research on reading and spelling, and she's found that only 4% of English words are truly irregular and need to be learned through whole word methods, which means by and large, the majority of a language can be taught through a rule-based approach. And spelling does have layers, so we can't forget about morphology. So we do want to make sure we're teaching our prefixes, our suffixes, our bases, how those affect the meaning of those words. And we can layer in some of that etymology as well, as we go. For instance, if there's clues to spelling, if I say the word chemistry, well, chemistry is a Greek word. I know that because in English, CH cannot say k. So it's those interesting facts that are seemingly random, but not random, that kids often latch onto, because it makes sense to them. They can attach it to their background knowledge, and they start to build, stronger language skills, and the spelling translates to the reading. This piece of artwork, I should say what this is. This was a recycled artwork project one of my students completed, and I think that they were having a bad day that day because this little dude does not look happy. That's a soda can for a mouth. I always found that kind of cute. So, I say this systematic and explicit spelling, and unless you have some background, you might be thinking like, what is that? What does that look like? This is how I teach systematic and explicit spelling. I do have bias because I am the author of this program, but this is how this came about. I was taking a training in Orton Gillingham methods, and 5-day training. And by the end of the week, I'm waiting to get all these really cool names of rules, these spelling rules, the names and the faces. I was waiting the whole week for this stuff. And, day 5 comes around, and I raised my hand kind of sheepishly, and I said to the trainer, Orton Gillingham is known for explicit spelling rules. When do we get the names and faces? We had a huge bag of curriculum that came with this training, and there was nothing in there. And he said, well, I guess, we sketched some things out, the kite and the cat's pretty popular. And there's a couple other sketches, but essentially I found out that there were no names and faces. So I created them. And so what you see here are some samples of spelling rule cards. Each rule is given an image with hidden picture clues. Each rule has a name that has mnemonics embedded into it. If you were to flip these cards around, you'd have the definition of the rule on the back. And each of these rules pairs with a lesson plan. And so I was a special ed teacher at the time I started, creating this and getting the idea for this. And I just thought, gosh, if there was a way we could just make life easier for some of these kids who really struggle with reading, what would it be? Well, I felt like my hands were pretty tied in terms of curriculum choices as a teacher. There's just a little bit of red tape surrounding some of that stuff, especially 10 years ago. And so I thought, it's the spelling rules. It's absolutely, hands down, this is the most overlooked vehicle for teaching reading on the planet. That's my opinion, but seriously, if we can teach kids to spell using a rule-based systematic approach, we're going to be teaching them to read, because you can't teach this stuff without teaching your 7 types of syllables, without teaching syllable division patterns, without teaching what those do to the vowel sounds within our words. And along with that, you've got to teach your segmenting and blending and all of those things that Linnea Airy showed in her research are necessary for building strong readers. So can you see the rules? Well, I couldn't see them, so I created a rule system that I can see. This is just a sample. I've got 3 books that I've published. The first book covers closed and open syllable patterns. Second book covers 3 more syllable patterns, and the third covers the last 2. And so I gave them a name and a face, and we have fun with it. The kids have fun with it, and even older kids have fun with it. Makes everything quite relatable. I had a researcher tell me once, it's like taking plain oatmeal and really jazzing it up, giving it some brown sugar, some walnuts, blueberries, raspberries. I thought, okay, that's kind of a fun analogy. So here's my program. It's called Silver Moon Spelling Rules. It's just another tool you could use. It's not comprehensive, it's supplemental. So if you're using Wilson in your schools, you're using Spire or Slant System or Barton, whatever you're using, we plug that right in, we dovetail it right in. Because what I find is a weakness in a lot of our OG training is the spelling components. We have it in text, like we know what we need to teach in terms of rules, but how do I present it? How do I make it engaging and fun? And how do I make it relatable? This is what I created for teachers to make your life easier, and to make a student's day more enjoyable. The progression of targeted rules is as follows. So set 1 covers closed and open syllables. Set 2 are your sticky units like ing, ong, and so on and so forth. Silent E, consonant LE, and then your set 3 is vowel team and bossy R. All of this content should be mastered in a neurotypical student in and around the 3rd grade. But yet we've got kids, you can't skip this stuff. I tell my students all the time, you cannot skip teaching this stuff. It's non-negotiable if you're working with struggling readers. They have to know the syllable types. They have to know how to identify them. So this is just a cool tool you can use. Every syllable's been given a visual to help as a memory trigger, because memory is often really weak. This is a free resource you can download right from the website. I should say there's also a student version without all the wordiness, much cleaner copy, and you can print that off and give it to your students. And what I do with students is I create, I'm going to show you here, I got one sitting right here. I create all my filters on shoots, a resource folder. So this is a plastic folder with metal prongs on the inside, and you're not going to be able to see it, but what I do is I put their helper pages or their resource pages inside that folder, and this is their reading support system. They keep this on their desk anytime they're doing reading and spelling, and then when they come across a problem, they have tools to answer their questions. So instead of teacher, what's this? How do I do this? And instead of giving them an answer or saying, well, can you remember? They have a tool to look up the answer. I think someone has their microphone still on, and I can hear some background noise here. We'll just check through everyone here. Okay, so another part of teaching using a science of reading based approach is really being very deliberate. So when you're spelling one syllable words with students, or maybe when you're spelling within a syllable in a multisyllabic word, you're having them assign one sound or unit of sound per finger. So finger spelling would look like this. Let's say at a very simple level, we have the word camp. You know, student hears a whole word camp, they repeat that word. So you make sure they're hearing each and every sound, they're pronouncing it correctly. And then they're gonna go k, ah, p. And so you can see whether or not they are able to segment that word into its individual sounds and represent those sounds on their fingers. Sometimes it's just that extra kinesthetic step that takes them to the next level. Some of our students are so tactile, right? They really need to feel what they're doing. And so this is a big help. You know, another way to do this is just to use Elkonin boxes. I also call those sound boxes. So on your right, you know, if those set of boxes were empty and I took the word camp once again, the student could fingerspell k, a, p. But then they could also represent those sounds. If fingers are too hard because of fine motor needs, you could use empty boxes and represent those sounds with colored tokens or some sort of manipulative. If you want to bring phonics into this and go beyond phonemic awareness, beyond just hearing and listening, you could have the student write the letters for each sound in a box. Oftentimes these are paired. I guess I don't have a picture of the pairing, but like I just bought 10 frames on Amazon, usually used for math, but my 10 frames are magnetic. They're super cool because a student can use the top row of the 10 frame to do the phonemic awareness piece. So they're representing each sound with a token, a magnetic token. They're segmenting those sounds to do that, but then on the window underneath the top of the 10 frame, because it's a double row, they can take their dry erase marker and write in those sounds. So, and that's one way to scaffold this, to go from phonemic awareness to phonics. All right, we're getting into a little more decoding here. Beyond one syllable words, I think that slide was a little out of order, sorry about that. But beyond one syllable words, actually, this is still one syllable. Okay, so we talked about the spelling piece. I see where we're going. We're going into the decoding piece. You know, touching and saying is a great strategy. So a student sees a word in print at a very basic level. They literally are just putting their finger under each one of those letters and saying the sound that it says. And then they're blending those sounds together and saying it fast like a word. Now, what I see happen quite often is, you know, a student will touch and say every sound correctly. Like you're like, great, this is going really good. And then they go to blend the word and all of a sudden the sounds are wrong. Okay, have any of you seen that happen before? This often has to do with auditory memory problems, short-term memory problems. And so watch the student's eyes. You know, where are their eyes when they're blending? Are they all of a sudden looking up at you and then trying to blend from memory? It's usually the case, because if they're trying to blend from memory and they're getting the wrong words, it means they're struggling with that short-term memory piece. So direct them to keep their eyes on the word and blend while you're looking at the word. It sounds quite simple, but it can take care of a lot of issues. So by third grade, kids should be well on their way to mastering syllabication. So that is, you know, all 7 types of syllables and identifying them. why are syllables so important? Well, if you can determine what kind of syllable you have within your words, it really it tells you what the vowels will say, right? Because if you have a closed syllable, you get a short vowel. If you have an open syllable, you get a long vowel. If you have a vowel team, you get a long vowel, at a very basic level. There are some more advanced nuances to this, but remember, we're using a building block process of teaching. And so we're going to keep it simple. And as students master content, we'll teach more advanced concepts later on. Here's an example of students dividing up multisyllable words. By dividing, it is a formula. Literally, it's a 4-step formula where you first identify your vowels, because every talking vowel creates a new syllable. Second, you count how many letters are between those vowels. If there are 2 letters between your vowels, typically you just split them apart. If there are 3, you give it a 1-2 split. If there are 4, you give it a 1-3 split, so on and so forth. There are a couple little nuances to that, but it's pretty black and white. It's pretty basic. And kids catch on to this formula because it's just so logical, and they don't have to guess anymore. You identify what type of syllable you have, and then you identify the sounds those letters can make, determined by that syllable pattern. And this is a teacher resource, of course. I showed this to you before, and there's a student resource as well. Here it is. I keep this in the students resource folder. We do lots of different activities with syllable types, and sometimes I'll get a deck of word cards and I'll only have words that follow the patterns they've learned. So this is in a controlled fashion, and they'll sort words according to syllable pattern. And we'll talk about what sounds the vowel makes, how they can tell. A closed syllable pattern, there's 2 rules for that. I teach kids it's 1 vowel. Does your syllable have 1 vowel? It's real easy to identify. It's yes or no. And that vowel has to be closed at the end. And we do lots of movement when we're teaching, so it's closed at the end. Is your vowel closed at the end? Yes or no? Okay, great. If there's 1 vowel closed at the end, the vowel's going to be short. This stuff is just so much fun to teach, especially when you can pair it with some fun visuals and give some of these concepts some life and personality. Here are your syllable division rules. In a nutshell, I mean, this is the abbreviated student version. Once you teach this in detail, you could give this sheet to your students as a reference. I also keep this one in all of my students' resource folders, because if they forget, then they have something to rely on. This is what happens with our students that have learning disabilities. They can master a concept and have it really, really solid for quite a long time. But then one day you'll introduce a new, more complex concept, and all of a sudden the previous concept just kind of falls off their plate. And what's happening is it's not gone completely. It's still there, but that, the cognitive resources they're using to wrestle with a new concept is taking precedent, and they just don't have the resources to pull that old concept back. And this is where scaffolding gets really, really important, because you've got to have those resources in place that they can kind of lean on when they're wrestling with new, more advanced stuff. And I didn't realize my computer is not plugged in here. So let me just, here we go. Here we are. Solve that problem. Yeah, we could do entire classes on these division rules and spelling rules. It'd be a lot of fun. We don't have time for that in this workshop, but we're going to move into text choice. So your choice of text that you use with students, it makes a big difference. So we have this whole decodable text concept, which is known as controlled text. And we have the opposite, which is uncontrolled text. Traditional literature is uncontrolled, meaning the sky's the limit in terms of what type of word patterns and phonetic patterns are in that particular reader. When you're using decodable text, it means that material in that text is 80%, at least 80% predictable, based on phonics skills and syllable patterns the student's already been taught. So what is this do to a student's confidence? Shoots it straight up, right? They start to experience so much more confidence with their skills because all of a sudden they know they can read 80% or more of the words on that page because they've been explicitly taught those patterns. They know those phonetic concepts. And they don't have to guess anymore based on context clue or picture clue. The anxiety starts to diminish. There's a lot less stress when you use decodable text. I attended a conference last Friday and I had to borrow a couple of the images from that conference. Wiley Blevins was one of the speakers. He is a graduate of Harvard University, and he does a lot of research on decodable versus undecodable text. And this was one of his images. This is a sample of decodable text. As you can see, all of the words in green have the initial, I'm sorry, this is an example of whole word. My title is throwing me off here, whole word text. So in a whole word, more of a balanced kind of approach, you get a lot of opportunities and needs for guessing at the words based on picture clues and context clues, because the kids probably haven't learned the majority of the patterns that they're seeing on the page. So this type of text is really driven towards comprehension, right? Let's read words through background knowledge, vocabulary, picture clues, context. So now compare this with the color coding in this text. So your green words are your guessing words, your words where they're going to have to kind of guess through picture clue or context. Your red words are the decodable words. So this is a phonics-based type of a text. Now I'm gonna flip back again. You see the difference here? The point here is that when you use decodable text, you develop really strong reading behaviors because the students don't have to rely on context or guessing and the 3 cueing system. That's all fine and great if a student already knows how to read, but you want them to rely on good orthographic mapping strategies, good decoding strategies. And when you use text such as this, they're able to use those strategies and they don't have to rely on other strategies that aren't always accurate. I'd never heard this stated this way, that the text determines the cues children use. That was a huge light bulb for me on Friday. I thought, wow, I knew about decodable text and I knew why it was important, but I've never heard it stated just so simply and eloquently. Depending on your text, it'll show you how your kids will decode, because if they can decode the text, they will. If they can't, they won't. Okay, and phonetically irregular words are taught completely different, right? So in the reading research world, we want all words to become sight words. that is read on perception. You see a word and immediately you know what it says and you know what it means without even futzing with sounding it out. Sight words in the education world that term is used for words that are high frequency or phonetically irregular or both. So for words that are phonetically irregular, also known as your sight words, this is what is recommended when you look at the science of reading, because some memorization and memory supports are going to be necessary. You're going to select a word list that you want to use. Usually districts have adopted their own kind of high frequency word list. Maybe it's Fry or Dolce or something in between, but select a word list. Give a screener. So use that word list to give maybe the first 10 to 15, maybe 20 words, and find out what words the kids can read versus can't read. And then do the same for spelling. Which words can they spell? Which words can't they spell? And you're going to create a deck of flashcards for your reading words, the words they can't read automatically, and a deck of flashcards for your spelling words, the words that they can't spell automatically or correctly. And it's recommended only to do 3 words at a time. Which is totally different from, how we're usually approaching this in schools. Usually we have about, I'd say average is about 10, maybe even more. So pick 3 words from your reading list, 3 words from your spelling list. And when you're working on these words, you want to assign some sort of logic to why they're so irregular and so hard to remember. So let's say I take the word does. It does morphologically can be explained and it makes a lot of sense, but we're not going to go there today. So if I listen to the sounds in does, I have d, z. Okay, the D is totally normal. It's what you'd expect. So we're not going to assign that as a tricky letter. Essentially what we're trying to do is pick a letter that is tricky. Then I hear the uhs. All right, well, that O and E is kind of odd because it's saying which is actually a use sound. So when I did this with a student, they chose the E as tricky because they could remember do really easily. So they remembered does starts with do. The E is saying so they made the E red and assigned it their tricky letter. Sometimes this is called heart words. And then S does often say Z in words if it's a single S. So that wasn't all that uncommon. But having this conversation around the word about what the sounds are, what the letters are, what says what you wouldn't expect, and then assigning one letter tricky is really what is done to help memorize these irregular words. So your top card is a spelling card. That's where you get the red letter word. And there's a multisensory process you use to memorize this. You look at it, try to visualize it. You usually air write it. So while you're saying those letters, so it's D, O, E, S. Sometimes instead of air writing, you might be spelling it on the wall. And if you use 2 fingers, you've got more feedback. I'm forgetting the term for that, but you're getting more feedback as opposed to just using your index finger. So trace with 2 fingers, D, O, E, S. And that movement helps support the memory system. And thirdly, so you visualize it, you've written it with big, large gross motor movements. You want to get your arm fully extended. So you're using that shoulder muscle, that's gross motor. If the kids are out here just kind of spelling with their fingertips, that's not gross motor. So you're not going to get the most memory for that type of movement. And then thirdly, you're covering that word up and having them spell it on paper. Have them identify the red letter or the tricky letter. So they either underline it or they physically make it red with a red pencil. And then last step is most important. Why is that letter tricky? Have them explain. Well, the E says a strange sound. It says The O doesn't say what it should say either, but I can remember that because I remember do is in does. And everyone's reasoning, maybe a little bit different. So you want kids to kind of run with this, provided it makes sense. So a little bit of guided discovery here. The bottom card is a reading card. Typically with memorizing irregular sight words for reading, we don't assign a red letter, but we can assign a clue. So the clue for this student was a U in the corner, and we want to try to scaffold this back. So we'll use the U to help them trigger what that word says at first, maybe the first couple times we run through those words, but then I'm going to use my thumb to cover it up. Can they start pulling what that word is from their memory without seeing their clue after some time? And you want to shoot for 3 to 5 correct repetitions on consecutive days. Once you get that, put them in your retired pile, mix them up and review those once in a while, but go ahead and add a new word, into your deck. And the whole process starts again. A lot of the resources I shared today, it's just all supplemental. You can reference these and download these at silvermoonspellingrules.com. I have a blog and a vlog on this website, and at the end of the blogs, there's a lot of really fun activity pages and actually games, really interactive games. There's Connect 4 game, bowling game, baseball game, all sorts of stuff you can print in full color, laminate, and use for small groups, or just put on your screen if you're remote teaching. It works really well that way also. All the screeners are on this website as well. And that's a wrap. I wanted to get a lot of information to you today, and so I was moving awfully fast. So I hope most of this made sense to you. But does anyone have any questions? No one? The questions are the fun part. Come on. All right. If we don't have questions, I'm going to send this recording to you. And this has been a lot of fun to offer through the university. So I believe it's slated to be offered again in the spring. Same workshop. So if you have colleagues that would be interested, let them know, give them a heads up that it'll be in the catalog again when the spring semester rolls out for continuing ed stuff. And it was really great having you. Please keep in touch. And, if you want us kind of keep a pulse on resources that I'm producing, a great way to do that is to subscribe to my newsletter. If you don't know how to do that, send me an email and I'll put your email address on the list. And that's a wrap. So thank you so much for being a wonderful group to work with. Guys, have a great evening. I'm just going to kind of hang out till everyone's gone.